December 19th, 1944. 8:47 in the morning, the Ardennes forest stood frozen and silent under a sky heavy with snow. Through the fog-streaked periscope of an M10 Wolverine tank destroyer, Private First Class Ray Thompson watched something that would haunt German commanders for months to come. A full panzer column, 12 vehicles strong, was threading its way through a narrow forest road just 800 yards from his position. One Tiger tank led the formation. Behind it rolled Panzer IVs, half-tracks packed with infantry, and fuel trucks bringing up the rear. They were moving with confidence, certain that American forces were scattered, disorganized, and too afraid to engage. Thompson had explicit orders: observe and report. Do not fire. Do not give away your position. Wait for authorization from command. But his radio was dead. Static filled his headset where commands should have been, and those tanks weren't heading toward some distant objective. They were bearing down on the road to Neuville, a small crossroads town where the 101st Airborne was already surrounded at Bastogne. If that column reached its target, hundreds of American paratroopers would be cut off from their last supply line. Thompson made a decision that broke every rule in the field manual. Without permission, without backup, without a single word from command, he reached for the firing mechanism. His loader looked at him, questioning. Thompson's voice was steady, almost too calm. "Third vehicle," he said. "Then we move." What happened next would be recorded in German after-action reports as an attack by a full American artillery battery, multiple guns, coordinated fire, devastating precision. But there was no battery. There was only Ray Thompson, a farm boy from Kansas with a talent for angles and a notebook full of sketches. In the next 30 minutes, he would turn a disciplined German armoured column into a burning graveyard of steel. And he would do it by breaking every rule meant to keep soldiers like him alive. Raymond Charles Thompson grew up in the kind of place where horizons stretched so far they hurt your eyes. Western Kansas was all wheat fields, dust storms, and silence, the kind that made you think too much or not at all. His father, Charles, ran a small engine repair shop in town. Tractors, grain threshers, the occasional Ford that sputtered its way in from the county road. His mother, Anna, taught 7th grade mathematics at the local schoolhouse, and it was from her that Ray inherited something most soldiers never carried into combat: a love of geometry. Even as a boy, Ray saw the world in angles and measurements. He could estimate the height of a grain silo by the length of its shadow. When other kids threw rocks at tin cans, Ray built a slingshot with a counterweight system, calculating trajectory and force. He wasn't trying to show off, he was just curious. How far could something go if you understood the physics behind it? By 1942, when Ray was 22, the war had already swallowed half the young men in his town. He enlisted not because he was eager to fight, but because the army offered engineering training. He wanted to build bridges, design structures, maybe work for the Corps of Engineers after the war ended. Instead, they put him in a tank destroyer battalion and handed him a 76mm gun. His first combat came in Normandy, in the suffocating hedgerows where you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. He watched a friend, Jimmy Delgado, burn alive when a German shell caught their half-track. Another man, Frank Murray, stepped on a mine outside St. Lo and simply disappeared. After that, Ray stopped believing in luck. He started believing in patterns. He carried a small spiral notebook in his jacket. Every German vehicle he encountered, he sketched it, noted the weak points, the blind spots, the places where armour was thinnest. He studied how panzer columns moved, how they stacked vehicles for mutual support, how they relied on tight formations in narrow terrain. Other soldiers thought he was strange. They called him the quiet clock because when Ray spoke, it was brief, precise, and usually timed to the second. By December 1944, Ray Thompson had survived France, survived the drive toward Belgium, survived dozens of engagements that should have killed him. But he had never fired without orders. Not once. He was disciplined, methodical, careful. Until the morning when careful wasn't enough anymore. On December 16, 1944, the German army launched its final major offensive on the Western Front. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, was Adolf Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Soviets closed in from the east. Over 200,000 German troops, supported by more than 1,000 tanks, slammed into a thinly defended section of the American line in the Ardennes forest. The attack came in fog and snow, perfect weather for concealing movement. German infiltrators, some dressed in American uniforms, sowed confusion behind the lines. Radio communications jammed or went silent. Units lost contact with headquarters. Some American battalions simply vanished overnight, overrun or captured before they could send word. For the men of the 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, the chaos was immediate. Ray Thompson's unit was positioned near Neuville, a small Belgian town north of Bastogne. Their mission was defensive: hold key roads, prevent German armour from reinforcing the encirclement of the 101st Airborne. But orders kept changing, friendly positions shifted by the hour, no one knew where the front line was anymore. Inside a drafty farmhouse 3 days before the encounter, Thompson sat with his crew while their commanding officer briefed them on the rules of engagement. The officer's voice was flat, exhausted. "No one fires without confirmation from command. I don't care what you see. I don't care how close they are. We do not give away our position unless ordered." The reason was simple. In the fog of war, misidentification was common. American tank destroyers had accidentally fired on friendly armour before. The cost had been catastrophic. Entire units wiped out by their own side. So the rule was ironclad. Wait for orders. Thompson understood the logic. He even agreed with it. But as he sat in his M10 Wolverine on the morning of December 19th, watching a German column snake through the forest below, that logic collided with a harder truth. His radio was dead. Static hissed where commands should have been. His crew had tried every frequency, every backup channel. Nothing came back. And those tanks, 12 of them, maybe more, were heading straight for the road to Neuville. If they got through, the 101st Airborne would lose its last supply corridor. Hundreds of men, already surrounded and low on ammunition, would be completely cut off. Thompson looked through his periscope again. The Tiger tank at the front moved with mechanical confidence, treads crunching through snow. Behind it, the Panzer IV-4s rolled in tight formation. Half-tracks filled with infantry followed, and at the rear, fuel trucks and supply vehicles completed the convoy. It was a textbook German assault column, disciplined, coordinated, lethal, and it was perfectly vulnerable. Thompson's hands hovered over the firing controls. His loader, Corporal Eddie Marsh, stood frozen, waiting for the order that shouldn't come. His driver, Specialist Tony Calabresi, sat silent in the hull below. His assistant gunner, Private George Keller, kept glancing at Thompson, then back at the column, then at Thompson again. "We're not cleared," Keller finally said. His voice was barely a whisper. Thompson didn't answer right away. He was calculating. Wind speed, negligible. Range, 800 yards, well within effective distance. Terrain. The Germans were boxed in by steep forest banks on both sides. No room to manoeuvre, no room to scatter. If he hit the right targets in the right sequence, he could turn their formation into a trap. But if he was wrong, if those weren't German tanks, if the column was somehow friendly, if his judgment failed, he would be responsible for a massacre. And even if he was right, firing without orders was a court-martial offence. He could be stripped of rank, imprisoned, or worse. "Third vehicle," Thompson said quietly. Marsh blinked. "What?" "Load armour piercing. Target the third vehicle in the column." "Ray, we don't have clearance." "I know." Marsh hesitated, then reached for the shell. His hands were shaking. Thompson adjusted the elevation dial with the precision of a watchmaker. He'd spent months studying German formations, knew that the third vehicle in a panzer column was often a command tank, officers, radios, coordination. If he took it out, the rest of the formation would lose cohesion. More importantly, destroying the third vehicle would create a physical roadblock. The tanks. Ahead couldn't reverse without colliding with wreckage. The tanks behind couldn't advance. The entire column would be paralysed. Thompson exhaled slowly, his breath fogged in the freezing air inside the tank. He could hear his heartbeat, slow and steady, like a metronome. Then he pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The recoil slammed through the Wolverine's frame. Snow exploded into the air from the muzzle blast, and 800 yards away, the 3rd Panzer IV erupted in flames. For a moment, nothing happened. The column rolled forward, oblivious. Then the burning tank slewed sideways, blocking the road. The Tiger at the front tried to reverse. The Panzer behind it braked hard. Confusion rippled through the formation like a shockwave. Thompson didn't wait. Reload, 6th vehicle, move position after the shot. Marsh slammed another shell into the breach. Thompson adjusted, fired. The half-track carrying infantry exploded, its fuel tank igniting instantly. Bodies were thrown into the trees, fire spread to the underbrush. Then Thompson did something no German commander expected. He moved, just 20 yards to the left, repositioning before the enemy could pinpoint his location. From their perspective, it looked like multiple guns firing from different positions. 8th vehicle, Thompson said. His voice was still calm, almost detached. Fuel truck. The 3rd shot was the most devastating. The tanker erupted in a biblical fireball, flames jetting skyward, heat scorching the trees. The blast knocked 2 nearby infantrymen off their feet. Smoke billowed across the forest floor, backlit by orange and black. From a distance it sounded like an entire artillery battery had opened fire. But it wasn't. It was one man, one gun, and a gut feeling that he couldn't let those men die for the sake of protocol. The Germans didn't know what hit them. Officers screamed into radios. Tank commanders spun their turrets, searching for targets they couldn't see. Infantry scattered into the woods, diving behind trees, firing blindly into the smoke. They were certain they'd been ambushed by a full American defensive line. Multiple tank destroyers, coordinated fire, pre-planned fields of fire. But there was no ambush. There was just Ray Thompson, repositioning after every 2 shots, using the terrain and the fog to his advantage. Every time he fired, he moved, 10 yards here, 20 yards there, just enough to make German gunners doubt their aim, just enough to create the illusion of multiple guns. He fired again. A 4th Panzer caught the shell in its flank and cooked off, its ammunition detonating in a chain reaction that tore the turret from its hull. The Tiger at the front finally managed to rotate its main gun toward Thompson's last known position, but by then Thompson had already displaced. The Tiger's shot obliterated a stand of pine trees, but hit nothing. Inside the Wolverine, the crew worked with frantic precision. Marsh's hands were blistered from loading shells. Keller's voice was hoarse from shouting coordinates. Calabrese kept the engine idling, ready to move at a second's notice. And Thompson was ice. Every shot was deliberate. Every movement calculated. He wasn't trying to destroy the entire column. He couldn't. He didn't have enough ammunition for that. What he was doing was far more surgical. He was dismantling their ability to function as a unit. By targeting specific vehicles, command tanks, fuel trucks, infantry carriers, he was stripping away their coordination, their mobility, their morale, and it worked. By the 30-minute mark, the German column was in chaos. 5 vehicles destroyed outright, 3 more immobilized. Survivors from the rear had already turned and fled back down the forest road. The Tiger, isolated and unsupported, finally withdrew, reversing slowly through the smoke and wreckage. The road to Neuville remained open. Thompson lowered his periscope and sat back. His hands were trembling now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline draining away. He'd fired 8 shells, made 8 decisions, broken 8 rules, and saved God knows how many lives. Keller broke the silence. "You think Command's going to be okay with this?" Thompson didn't answer. He just stared at the smoke rising through the trees. Hours later, American forces moved in to clear the road. What they found looked like the aftermath of a coordinated airstrike. Vehicles stacked like dominoes, burned out frames fused together by heat, frozen corpses sprawled across the snow, trees splintered like matchsticks. But what was missing, what made the scene so strange, was the absence of American casualties. There were none. Because there had only ever been one gunner. When captured German soldiers were interrogated, their stories didn't match. Some said they'd been attacked by a full artillery battery, 6 guns, maybe more. Others claimed it was an ambush by American paratroopers with anti-tank weapons. One lieutenant, his face smudged with ash, insisted they'd been hit from 3 different angles simultaneously. There were many guns, he said in broken English. We were surrounded. American intelligence officers exchanged glances. There hadn't been a battery, there hadn't been an ambush. There had been one M10 Wolverine and a gunner who, officially, had never been given permission to fire. The Germans called it Die Geisterbatterie, the ghost battery. To them, it was impossible that a single tank destroyer could have struck with such precision, such timing, such devastating effect. Their doctrine taught that Americans were slow to respond, overly reliant on orders from above. The idea that one soldier had acted independently with that level of tactical sophistication didn't fit their understanding of how American forces operated. But Thompson had done exactly that. He'd thought like a German commander, understood their formation logic, their reliance on tight convoy discipline, and then exploited it mercilessly. Back at battalion headquarters, Thompson filed his report. His commanding officer, Captain William Langston, read it in silence. Page after page of sketches, range estimates, wind calculations, firing sequences. Langston looked up, his face unreadable. "You know," he finally said, "if this had gone wrong, if even one of those was friendly fire..." Thompson nodded. "I knew what I saw, sir. No one authorised this. I understand." Langston exhaled slowly. "Go get some rest. I've got to send this upstairs." Upstairs meant division command, which meant scrutiny, which often meant punishment, especially for enlisted men who acted outside the chain of command. But something else happened first. Scouts from the 101st Airborne arrived. They'd been sent to assess the road conditions, expecting to find it swarming with German armour. Instead, they found twisted wreckage. They asked which unit had taken it out. Langston said it wasn't a unit, it was one gunner. Word spread faster than orders. Thompson didn't receive a court-martial, but he didn't receive a parade either. What he got was something more unusual. Quiet recognition. Division intelligence reviewed his field notes. They interviewed his crew, they studied the wreckage patterns, the vehicle placements, the firing trajectories, and then they did something unexpected. They sent his diagrams to the US Army Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Within weeks, instructors were teaching something they called asymmetrical engagement sequencing, a technical term for what Thompson had done instinctively. Don't aim for the front of a column, aim for the collapse. Create artificial choke points through selective targeting. Exploit the enemy's own formation discipline against them. It was revolutionary, and it came from a Kansas farm kid who had never attended college. Thompson himself was quietly reassigned to train other gunners. He taught them how to read German formations, how to use terrain for concealment, how to calculate wind and distance under pressure. His diagrams became teaching aids. His decision-making process became doctrine. But the official record remained cautious. His after-action report included a single phrase. Acted outside standard protocol, but in accordance with battlefield necessity. It was a bureaucratic way of saying he broke the rules, but he was right. In November 1944, Thompson received a small envelope with a typed notice. He'd been awarded the Bronze Star for meritorious service. There was no ceremony, no photographer. The medal was handed to him at a quartermaster's desk along with a form to sign. He looked at the box for a long time before placing it inside his duffel bag. Years later, a military historian would track Thompson down. By then, he was in his 80s, living in a modest home in Kansas with his wife and a cat named Murphy. The historian asked him about that day in the Ardennes. Thompson took a long time to answer. "I remember the trees," he finally said. "I remember how still it was before the first shot, like the world was holding its breath." When asked why he didn't wait for orders, Thompson replied simply, "Because by the time the radio worked, it would have been too late." He paused. "I didn't break the rules, I just stepped past them for a minute, long enough to do what had to be done." Ray Thompson never won the war, but he saved a road, he saved a supply line, he saved the men of the 101st Airborne from being cut off completely. And, in doing so, he reminded the army of something it sometimes forgot, that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it calculates, sometimes it waits for the perfect moment, and sometimes it pulls the trigger not out of defiance, but out of a deeper sense of duty. Thompson's story never made front-page headlines. There were no newsreels featuring his face, but among the men who walked past that wreckage, among the paratroopers whose supply line stayed open, among the officers who studied his methods, his name became something more than a rank. It became a standard. After the war, Thompson returned to Kansas. He married a woman named Helen, started a small repair shop, and taught his son geometry by marking angles in the dirt with a stick. He rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked what it was like, he simply said, "Loud, fast, and full of choices you don't get to make twice." But in the back of his closet, in a yellowed file marked Ardennes Ridge Engagement, sat a map, a crew photo, and a single shell casing, polished clean. The Geisterbatterie became part of military lore, not as myth, but as lesson. It was studied in classrooms at West Point, referenced in tactical manuals during the Cold War, used as a case study for training officers in flexible command decision-making. Because sometimes war doesn't reward those who follow instructions, it rewards those who understand when to break them. Ray Thompson died quietly in 2003, at the age of 83. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his repair shop, his family, his service in World War II. It didn't mention the column, it didn't mention the Geisterbatterie, but at his funeral, an elderly man in uniform stood by the grave. His name was Samuel Archer. He'd been a lieutenant with the 101st Airborne in December 1944. He leaned over and placed a letter on the casket. On the outside, he'd written, "Noville Road, December 19th, 1944. We made it because of you." Inside was a single line, handwritten, "You saved us." That's how legends are born. Not in statues or textbooks, but in the memory of the men whose lives hung by a thread and were saved by someone who refused to let go. Ray Thompson didn't break the rules for glory. He broke them because sometimes the only right choice is the one they didn't teach you to make. And in that moment, alone in the fog, with no one watching and no one to give him permission, he made it anyway.